Welcome back. So, we got my fins here. These are fins that I shaped in a previous video before we laminated the board. The reason why is because it's easier to shape these first before laminating, because then you're going to get dust everywhere in your shop and it's just not great unless you happen to do it outside. So we got these ready. So check out that video if you haven't yet. So we need to talk about the placement of these fins and how, where, and how we like the riding style will play a factor in that. So I have my shortboard here with a thruster configuration with 3 fins. I'm just going to replicate this. I suggest if this is your first board, which it probably is if you're watching these videos, or you're just trying to get better at shaping boards, maybe do your own research, read up on fin placement or the type of fins you want to use on your board. But I'm going to just trace off this existing setup because I really like this one. I like this thruster setup. I like the placement of the fin cant and the fin toe in, and I'll talk about that next. So it's quite easy to do the fin placement using a diagram, and this is off of Green Life Surf Supply, and I'm no way affiliated or sponsored by them, as I've mentioned previously. It's just that they were really super helpful, and they sell good surfboard building supplies, and they have good instructions on building boards. So this is a diagram off their website that you can use if you're just starting out until you figure out what you want to do. And they have one for a thruster configuration, and they have one for a quad and a single fin. Now, basically what I'm going to do is just measure off this existing board. I'm going to measure up from the tail up and figure out that mark, and that'll be, for the center fin on transpose the measurement on the other board. Same thing here, I'm going to measure in on both sides of the fin here and then just place it on the other board, and then measure the distance between these two, between the rear fin and then the side fin for the distance. Really simple. But we need to make a decision on the fin cant and the fin toe in. And what those are is the fin cant is, if you can look at this board here, the fin cant is the angle of this surfboard fin in relation to perpendicular to the board, but then either splayed outward or inward. Well, typically it's splayed outward, so that's the fin cant. So let's just take one of these fins here and let's exaggerate it. These are the 2 outside fins. So let's say they're perpendicular to the board right now. Well, your fin cant is going to be like this. So that's exaggerated, of course. So it's going to be like that, parallel, and then out like that. And what fin cant does is it provides a little bit more maneuverability. The more fin cant, the more maneuverable, the looser feeling the board will be. The less fin cant, the more drive the board will have. It'll track really nice, but it's not going to be as, I hate to say responsive. It just really depends, because the size of the fins also play a factor in the type of the fin and the shape of the fin. But this is just generally speaking in broad terms. So that's the fin cant. I suggest you just trace off of an existing board that you really like and kind of go from there and play with it. So the next is the toe in. So the toe in is the angle of these fins facing into the stringer, the middle of the board. So if you can imagine, if these were on the surfboard, well then instead of this, it's going to be this angle. So it's going to be toed in. If any of you are familiar with an alignment in a car, they usually reference the toe in on the wheels for when they do an alignment. So same thing on the fins. This is toe in, and you got to figure out what angle you want there. So the more toe in, the more responsive the board will be. However, that comes off course. Again, there's a trade-off. You're going to get more drag when you're paddling through the water, of course, because you have more angle and there's more deflection. More water is going to be hitting it. It's going to be deflecting off. So it's going to slow down your paddling a little bit. So you got to factor these in for what you want. Do your due diligence, do some research, or like I say, trace off of an existing board until you feel comfortable, until you get good at building boards, and then do some experimentation. I think that's it. Just around the fin cant though, when you're glassing on a fin, because Futures fins, they already have the fin cant built into the fin itself. The fin cant you need to have a template with angles in order to do the placement on the board. So Green Life Surf Supply again has this little template guide that you can trace out onto some cardboard or a piece of wood to use. It's unnecessary. You could just make your own, do a square and then cut 5 degrees or 4 degrees or 8 degrees or 6 degrees or whatever you want. You're going to have to figure out, again, what fin cant you want. I'm not going to really make any suggestion. I'm going with 5 degrees only because this is what I have existing on this board here. And that's what Futures actually kind of had on this setup, and I quite like it. It's kind of in between, between 4 and 8, so 5 seems like, or I should say, they have 4, 5, 6, and 8. So I just kind of went with 5 anyway, because it's kind of one of the mid ones to pick instead of on the outer edges, the outliers. Okay, let's set up and get the measurements onto the board and then put them on, and then we'll glass them onto the board. Oh, quickly, one last thing I wanted to mention. When people make glass on fins, typically they might put a layer of fiberglass on this fin before they glass it onto the board. I find that that's a little bit overkill. I'm not going to do that, but you may choose to do that. It's completely up to you, and all that involves is just glassing these like we laminated the board with some fiberglass and some epoxy resin, cleaning it up, and then glassing them onto the board, which gives it a lot of strength. In my opinion, it's a little bit overkill because if I hit the board on anything, I actually want the fins to snap off and not damage me or the board itself. I'd rather the fins snap off and break as opposed to my board or it actually hitting something and injuring me. Let's say it hits my leg or something. I don't want it so solid that it's gonna really, knock me. Although Future fins are pretty solid too, so I guess if these hit you, they might do some damage. But that's just my opinion. You don't have to go with that. Some people, like I say, fiberglass these and then put them on. So I'm just gonna take some measurements off of this board. This is about 3 1/4 inches. I'm gonna write that down. And then I'm gonna measure from the tip of this fin to the edge of this fin, just to see roughly. It's about 5 inches. And then I'm gonna measure inward for this fin, and it's about 2 1/4 on the bottom. And then I'm gonna go 1/4 of an inch this way. So when I draw this line on the other board, I'm gonna measure in 1/4 of an inch, make a mark, and draw a new line. I'm not gonna measure off of this board because there's a curve here, and this curve, you can't see it, but this curve here, I can't just take a measurement because that, if I transpose that, it won't come out properly. So I took a bottom measurement in, put my line down, and then I'll measure, and it's gonna be, the line's gonna be perpendicular to the stringer. And then I'm gonna measure in 1/4 of an inch, and then that'll be my fin toe in. So let's go over to the board and transpose these measurements. So 3 1/4 will be here. And we'll just lay our fin down for reference. And then we're gonna measure up 5 inches. I forgot to mention that I have this really nifty square, this tool, this template from Green Life Surf Supply for fin placement as well, and it can be also used for measuring your board. So it's a really neat tool. It's called the Shapers Versa Square. What I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to only use it for just as a straight edge, just so that I can, and I'll use it to double check my measurements, but not all of you will have this. But I'm just using this as a measurement. So I've measured up 5 inches because that was one of my measurements from the tip of this fin up to here. And then now I'm going to come across, and I'm just going to draw lightly here and here. Now ideally you probably wouldn't make marks as big as this, because if you had a board you were going to hot coat over, you'd probably just make some small marks and then put your fin placement down. I'm doing this so it's easier to show on camera, and it's also a little easier for me to work with and remember while I'm trying to film this at the same time. So now that we have that, so we have this directly perpendicular to the stringer, right? That's the main reason why I use this square tool, because there's a spot for you to put your stringer, and then that way you know this is square to the board, at least square to the stringer. Next, but you don't have to do that. You could have just squared it up with just a square, actually. If you lay down like a carpenter square right here, and then you could go across and then lay down a carpenter square and go across. In fact, let me grab that one right now and show you. So I have my speed square here, and I would just measure kind of like that, right, like that, and that's square. And I would make my mark, and then I would do the same on the other side. So you don't have to have this versus square thing in order to do it. But if you're shaping a lot of boards, I found this was really handy. So our next measurement is 2 1/4 inches in. So 2 1/4 is right there. And 2 1/4 is right here. So now we have our two spots right here, here and here. We are going to draw a line that is straight and then measure inward, 1/4 inch. That's the toe in that I want. So let's grab my carpenter square, and I'll do it with this, and then I'll double check it with the versus square. I'm trying not to touch the board because I don't have any gloves on, because I'm trying not to get any oil onto the board. You should be wearing gloves, but I'm just not. I'm being bad. These two lines are square to the board. Quick way to double check, take a measurement. Now that we have these lines parallel to the stringer, because we're going off the stringer, we're going to measure in 1/4 inch. So we're going to take the width of our fin, and we're going to just lay it right here, right like that. Lay that one down, that one. We'll lay this guy right here, and we'll make a mark like that. So that's the end of the fin. Next, we're going to measure in 1/4 inch. I find it easier to use a ruler at this point. Alright, I find it easier to switch to a ruler, but I think I've changed my mind. I think 2 inches or 2 1/4 inches is too far in here. I'm going to reduce this down to 1.5 inches. So I'm going to go 1.5 inches instead. Forget about these two inside lines. Okay, now forget about these two inside lines. We're going to go with the outside lines. So that outside line, we're going to toe in like that. So the fin will be like this, and we're going to tilt it. This is exaggerated. It's going to tilt inward like that. And we're going to do 1/4 inch. So that's why having a ruler is a little easier. So we're going to do 1/4 inch. So the way that fin will look now is it'll look something like that. So let's redraw these lines now. So we're going to take the bottom of the one line, and we're going to draw up and meet that 1/4 inch. So we'll have an angle now. Same thing on this side. Again, I'm just going to take a little acetone and just clean up that previous line. Okay, now that we're happy with the fin placement, you can kind of see these two lines. Hopefully that was a little clear. I had a little course correction there, but I think you get the idea. Next, we got to place these fins onto the board, and I have a little trick that I like to do. Some people don't like it, but I quite like it, and it works really well, and I haven't had any issues with it. You might read up on it and people say, oh, don't do it this way. But I really like using a couple dabs of hot glue just to hold the fins in place so that I can glass the fins on. And to recap, we drew in here about 1.5 inches. I think that's what it is. Let me double check now. I don't even remember. Yeah, it was 1.5 inches. And then we measured in 1/4 inch after we squared it to the stringer. So it's going to be placed like that. So you can kind of see that it's tilted inward like that. Next, we're going to, once we get the hot glue gun warmed up, we're going to take the fin cant tool, and that's the angle. So this is going to be perpendicular to the board. And then we're going to line that up like that, and we're going to tack it in place with some hot glue. We'll do it to both sides. We'll tack on the rear fin, and then we're ready for glassing. 3 dabs of glue, and we're just going to put it on the fin here. And that'll just tack it and hold it in place, and then the epoxy will fill in any gaps on the bottom, and the fiberglass will give it, when we glass the fin onto the board, it will give it strength. So this is just really a stopgap measure just to hold it in place. So let's do this real quick. So that's fin 1. Let's do the second fin. So here's one final view. Next, we need to cut out some fiberglass patches to laminate the fins onto the board, which will provide strength. So, because I've already glassed on the fins, I need to use this stand-in analog, another fin that's the exact same shape, or very close to the same shape, to cut out a few patches. So I'm going to do a total of maybe 6 patches, because I need 2 for each fin, 1 for each side, 3 fins, 3 times 2, 6. So something else that's needed to glass on fins is this stuff here. This is individual strands of fiberglass. I think they call this fiberglass roving. I just call it fiberglass rope, I guess. And what this will be used for is we're going to wet this with fiberglass, and then we're going to put it into the gusset here, into this angle spot at the base of the fin where it meets the board, and we're going to reinforce this gusset. So I got 3 pieces here. I might use all of it, I might not. I'm probably going to put like maybe 1 or 2 pieces, maybe 3 pieces here and on either side to reinforce it, and then put the glass patches that we cut out earlier on either side and then glass those on. Alright, let's get to it. And also, if you don't have this, you can also just cut out some chunks of fiberglass and just reinforce in here. And I've also seen some people pull apart larger weights, cloth weights of fiberglass into individual strands and use that as well. So I've just mixed up a little tiny bit of epoxy. I'm going to first put the roving onto the base of the fins. So I'm just going to wet this. I don't really have a method. I just kind of dump it in, get it soaked up a bit. I'll repeat for the other ones as well. Next, we're going to take the fiberglass and we're going to just stick it in place here, right like this. And then I like using a foam brush to dab the epoxy onto the fin. This is just my personal preference. Some people like using a squeegee. I just find this is a little cleaner, a little neater. Now, because I let the epoxy stay in the container, it's starting to heat up, so I don't have a lot of time to work with this now. So I'm gonna speed this up real quick and hopefully I can capture a lot of it on camera. And then I take the other piece and I do it on the other side. Really important to try to get all the air bubbles out of it too. So you want to make sure to get all the air bubbles out, and that should about do it. Now we got to let it set. We won't let it go set fully, and we're going to come back while the resin's still a little tacky, and we're going to trim off this excess fiberglass close down to the fin. Because I let this go a little too long, now it's kind of hard. I'm just going to use scissors just to cut the excess off. Normally I would use like a razor blade or an X-Acto knife to trim this off. If you catch it before it hardens completely, but unfortunately I didn't catch it in that kind of in-between phase. So I'm just going to trim this off and then I'll just sand the excess. And I'm just going to take a sander and I'm going to clean this up. Alright, so I've cleaned up the fins, I've removed the excess, I've sanded these so the edge of the fins are almost to the wood, but not all the way down to the wood. So this is the fins are nice and laminated onto the board now. I've cleaned up the spots where the fiberglass meets the bottom of the surfboard. So you want to feather this in really nicely. The better that you get that feather in now, the better your hot coat will be later. So make sure to keep this area here nice and flush, sand it flat, and you'll have really great results later. So it's better to sand now rather than to try to correct something later. So that's my method for glassing on surfboard fins. There's probably other ways of doing it. This is the method that I've used. It works well. I've had great results with it. So yeah, I think I'm going to end the video here. Next video will be hot coating the deck of the surfboard. So we're getting really close to getting a rideable surfboard, although there's still going to be quite a few more steps if you want to do artwork and then the gloss coat, installing the leash plug. So there's still some videos that I'm going to have to, this might be like 3/4 of the way done, this video series. But this is probably the section where people have the most trouble with, especially the lamination process in the previous few videos. So I'm going to end the video here. Hot coating is coming up next. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.